Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Frost and Sullivan in location with the Big Five Construct Southern Africa webinar as we kickstart the month of December. We're going to be talking about showcasing Africa's investable infrastructure opportunities, and we're grateful that you could make time this morning to come through and join us. I do want to introduce the team behind me that is supporting us this morning. It is the Big Five Construct Southern Africa team. We are led by Tracy Lieber, and she's our portfolio director. She's responsible for the entire built environment within the DMG events group. We've got Kenneth Masvigeli, who's our exhibition and publishing sales manager, myself, Lindiwe, and I am the content and program director. We have Jessica Chisti, who is the senior marketing manager, and she works along with Yolanda Mchawo, who's just joined this phenomenal team, and she's the marketing executive. We also have Ashley Gonzo, and he's the business development manager. This is the team that will be in contact with you from now up until June 2023, when we host the 10th edition of the Big Five Construct Southern Africa. We are excited to have been in the industry for so long, talking about construction, infrastructure, and especially joining together the African continent in how we can better these services. Well, through to this morning's agenda, we have Hendrik, and he is our speaker this morning from Frost and Sullivan. He is the Africa CEO responsible in the country. And with regards to Hendrik and the relationship we have with him, he has honed his abilities to identify, qualify, and strategize operationalize expansion opportunities over 25 years. So this is the man to reckon with. And he's got practical experience in Africa by supporting dozens of companies on the continent and beyond, reaching their corporate growth objectives. Hendrik has developed an in-depth understanding of how to take your organization to the next level despite the challenges of this exciting region. With a true passion for Africa and its people, Hendrik loves leading companies and teams to grow and expand commercially by taking advantage of the wealth of regional and global opportunities. As I said before, Hendrik is leading Frost & Sullivan in Africa, and Frost & Sullivan are our knowledge partners for the Big Five Construct Southern Africa, as well as the African Smart Cities Summit. They are the team that ensure our content lines up to what the industry market knowledge is, and they're the ones who vet us to say, are we producing quality programs? Is it up to par? Can someone sitting in the SADC region, east or west of Africa, read the content and actually see that it makes sense to their region? So Frost & Sullivan in Africa is a global strategy consulting and market intelligence firm with a long-standing presence in Africa. Frost & Sullivan helps organizations advance by informing them of market dynamics. They services span from the border policy and strategy cycle, leveraging their proactive commercial and technical research relevant to their sectors of focus to develop actionable intelligence for organizations. And this is why we're here this morning. Given their combination, focus and strategy and intelligence, Frost & Sullivan is ideally placed to support commercial and technically relevant market intelligence initiatives for a diverse set of institutions within their sectors of focus. Frost & Sullivan's range of process capabilities will ensure a pragmatic approach to developing practical and detailed initiatives with the strongest possible longer-term impact on the African continent. And just moving through with regards to how we will run this morning, we are having polls that you can participate in as our audience, and this is a way for us to gather information from you as the attendee with regards to what your needs are and what your specific solutions and why you would attend a webinar of this nature. And the first poll just jumped up. Do you think Africa will benefit from the global economic and political conditions in 2023 or be negatively affected by them? Africa will benefit from global conditions or Africa will be negatively affected by global conditions. So quite interesting. Interesting what the views here will be. Right. And then also we have got your Q&A. To ask Hendrik a question, click on the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen. Please unmute your mic or click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and type out your question there. Engage with us via the chat option, and Hendrik will be able to answer questions at the end of his presentation. And right now, I want to hand over to the man of the hour himself, Hendrik Malan. Thank you so much once again, sir, for your time this morning, your partnership with us as the Big Five Construct Southern Africa. It really is a pleasure to work with you and your team. Over to you, Hendrik. Thank you.
Linda, thank you so much, and it's an absolute pleasure, to All right, it seems like I'm back. Apologies for that. It seems like I popped in and then I popped out again. So let's try that again. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. I'm going to jump straight into it. That was quite a thorough introduction. So I'm just going to start off. Let me just share my screen here and get my presentation up and running. And then we can start getting into the content. All right, ladies and gentlemen, yes, good morning. As Lindiwe mentioned, Frost Sullivan is a combination strategy consulting and market intelligence firm. Now, as part of our work on the continent, we have the privilege to interact with quite a broad range of different stakeholders across the region. So anything from institutional investors, financiers, policymakers, across quite a broad range of platforms as well. So anything from COP27, in Egypt recently, to energy-specific events, like the Big Five Construct, to energy-specific events in Africa Energy Week, about a month or so ago, where there was a lot of very positive talk around investment in the energy sector, in Africa, across the broader region. A lot of capital, I think, very excited about some of the assets, especially some of the upstream assets in Africa. During that week, very positive, very constructive talks around investment. But the challenge, I think, is when we talk to so-called big capital in Africa about investments in the region, two issues are typically raised. And first is essentially a lack of investable projects. So, I can't tell you how many times we typically hear the phrase that you do not have the projects. There isn't more than enough capital available to invest in Africa, but you do not have a big enough pipeline of projects to invest in. And then the second challenge that typically gets raised is the fact that Africa's governance structures are typically quite weak. The ability to manage large scale or programmatic level capital is not strong enough in order to be able to handle the level of capital flow that is required to address Africa's legacy infrastructure challenges. Now, given the focus of Frost & Sullivan on enabling growth in and into the African region, we have partnered with organizations like African Green Infrastructure Investment Bank, African Investor, a legal firm, some innovative IT companies to address these two specific issues for the region, because we've heard these two challenges being raised by so many different institutions and organizations and individuals that are seemingly very interested in investing in the region, but for some reason cannot either find the projects or that are concerned about the governance structures I've mentioned. And this morning, I'm going to introduce you to one of the solutions that we as Frost & Sullivan put together around this perceived lack of investable projects. It's an infrastructure tracker that we developed, identifying and profiling projects over the various stages of development, infrastructure projects, around, across the region, sort of east, west, north, southern Africa, across all 54 countries. It's a big continent. It's 30 million square kilometers last time. And I checked, it's about 3 times the size of the entire Europe, 1,500 languages, which is part of the challenge, obviously. I think, in the region is the fact that because it's so diverse, because it's geographically so spread, it is often quite difficult for these institutions to get a grip and a handle on these projects, across the region. And we try to do that by consolidating them, putting them into one particular tracker, but also then identifying particular trends and dynamics to guide these investors and financiers, and the related stakeholder groups, because it's not just the investors and those financiers now looking at these trends and these opportunities, but also other companies, the OEMs, the equipment manufacturers, the project managers, all the related stakeholders that are associated with these investments, are now interested in getting an understanding of not just what's going on, but also where these investments, are heading. So building these things bottom up, we've built this Africa Infrastructure Investment Barometer, which I'm going to share some of the insights with you today. There's a summary report that will be made available to you by the conference organizers. The detailed tracker, with all the individual project data can be accessed through a subscription, and my contact details are at the back of this presentation, and our contact details will also be in the back of the summary report that will be made available by the conference organizers. All right, so without further ado, let's get stuck into some of the data. Let's marinate you in a bit of data. So we monitor these projects, as I mentioned, across phases of development. And what I mean by that is that there are typically, let's say, 3 main categories of phases of development: announced, committed, and ongoing, that we've classified. Announced or tentative projects are projects that still require further planning, or that are in the process of some kind of feasibility study. So typically these projects have multiple stages of feasibility analysis up until the point that they become a committed project, which is, in our view, a shovel-ready project that is looking for financing. The ongoing projects would be projects that are currently on the way. They're currently in the midst of being constructed. These projects quite often require refinancing or additional financing as well. So it's not like these projects do not necessarily pose an opportunity. And then the final category that we also track are cancelled projects. So it also provides us a bit of indication of the level of opportunity. So these are projects that more often than not are these mega projects in the region, that get ensnared in bureaucracy and sometimes corruption. They are cross-border. These mega projects in Africa have got a tendency of getting stuck at multiple levels, and these are the engagements that we also track. To provide us with indication of where the requirement is and where the need is, where the opportunity is, from a trend perspective. So it is important to track the cancelled project as well. So we currently have about 137 ongoing projects that we track, to the value of $51 billion. Quick calculation gives you about a $370 million per project value, which is a very decent number. So that also gives you indication that we do not track the smaller projects. So to be able to track the smaller projects becomes very cumbersome. The data also becomes inaccurate. So we have focused on the larger projects, not the smaller ones, across the region. If you add those up, obviously sort of that number becomes a lot bigger. But it is quite difficult, I think, to track the accuracy and the progress that those projects tend to make as well. There are another 267 projects that have been committed to, the shovel-ready projects, to the value of about $64 billion, which brings the overall total, obviously, to just over 100 billion, spread over 400 plus projects across the region. And this is across the whole of Africa, not just sub-Saharan, but North Africa included. There are an additional 291 million projects that are announced, that are tentative, that are still going through the various stages of feasibility. And these are the projects that we would typically also look to give us a good indication of where the level of opportunity is, the direction of opportunity, where the trends are going, both from a regional and from a sector and from a technology perspective as well. So what are the technologies that will be adopted, where will be the enabling infrastructure that will be invested in particular countries, in particular sectors, etc. It's also interesting to note that we have about $18 billion worth of cancelled projects, on the database. These are total energy, the LNG projects, for instance, in northern Mozambique would be on there, etc., that they are now looking or re-looking at to potentially sort of get back on track. We've seen photo material of some of the harbors being active again in northern Mozambique. So there are definitely some opportunity, I think, that and some activity around northern Mozambique's energy assets again, given Total's increased level of interest. Again, some of the activity globally, some of the turmoil in Eastern Europe, that is obviously sort of very bad for the rest of the world, but potentially could provide some level of opportunity, for Africa. And hence the poll question, the fact that there are a significant amount of global turmoil in the market, anything from high inflation rates through over stimulus, from the COVID era to the conflict in Eastern Europe, creating an energy crisis, greater demand in Africa, etc. And some of these factors obviously will have a negative impact on Africa, but a lot of these factors will also have a positive impact on Africa. Will have some positive dynamic if Africa can actually take advantage of the resultant opportunities in a positive way. Stepping into, say, for instance, some of the food production shortages that we see at a global level that will most likely take quite a long time to plug, given the fact that both Ukraine and Russia are two very big food producers of the world. It is quite challenging, I think, at the moment to spot particular trends from some of the infrastructure investment figures that we're seeing in 2022, for the simple reason that we are still recovering from COVID and obviously from the shocks from earlier this year, based on the Ukraine conflict. So we are still recovering, from quite a lot of projects that were put on hold, during the COVID period. We are definitely seeing an increase in the value of the overall number, or the overall value rather, of infrastructure projects being invested in the region. We've seen a reduction in the number of projects. So the average value of projects have actually increased, which is quite an interesting trend, I think, in itself. But overall, it is a bit challenging, I think, at this stage. It's a bit early to start spotting particular trends post-COVID, but I think 2023 is going to be a really interesting and a very dynamic year for Africa, from an infrastructure investment perspective. We're looking very much forward to, and we're very positive, I think, in general about 2023. Right, so if we are looking at the sectors, general construction and energy both have very healthy shares of the overall investments. Energy being quite a hot topic at present, given the dynamics in Eastern Europe, pun intended. Very interesting and dynamic conversations about Africa, both at COP27 and other sector-specific conferences in recent weeks, as I mentioned. Very constructive conversation around not just the upstream assets, so traditional feedstock, but also really the renewables sort of industry and the renewable sector, and Africa's potential to develop some of the green hydrogen opportunity, leverage some of its renewable energy potential in the region, not just for direct energy production, but also producing other goods to supply to the rest of the world. It is, however, important to mention that a more balanced portfolio is required to achieve our socioeconomic objectives. We've laid out our socioeconomic development aspirations through the Sustainable Development Goals, through Africa 2063. But in order to achieve these, we need larger proportions of investment going to other parts of infrastructure. We're looking at some of what we would call the foundational sectors, the foundational industry, information and communication technology, healthcare, transportation and logistics, water. Everything requires water. Anything from power generation to manufacturing to urbanization, everything requires good quality water infrastructure. And the amount of investment that we're seeing going into water infrastructure in Africa is just not sufficient in order to be able to support the socioeconomic development objectives on the one side, but also the industrialization and the urbanization that we require and that we're seeing and we're experiencing at the moment. New connectivity is a really important element as well. Solving, I think, so many of Africa's challenges, or playing an important role in any case in solving those challenges. Anything from education, accountability through the blockchain, mobile health, mobile wealth. The list goes on. So our investments around information and communication technology and connectivity, definitely needs to start taking a more significant proportion of overall investment. It does pose a significant opportunity, because I think the returns on some of those investments could be very positive, even for private sector players. It's not just a socioeconomic development opportunity. A lot of the opportunities are very much commercial opportunities as well, which I think is really important to understand. Ladue, I don't know if we want to run the second poll now, just around the biggest hindrances in infrastructure investment. So the second poll is really around what is the biggest hindrance to infrastructure investment in Africa, in your view? Is it the lack of bankable projects on the one side? Do you think it's the scale and the size of projects that are typically available? Do you think it's weak local governance in your experience? Or do you think there's a mismatch in the risk and return ratio of Africa projects, that risk and return ratio is a bit out of balance? You can give us your view on that. That would be very interesting, very very telling. All right, so then if we can drop down into one of the sectors, how are we doing on time? Yeah, we're doing quite well. Taking a look specifically at energy in Africa, it's quite interesting to take a look at the fact that Africa is home to about a fifth of the world's population, but attracts only about 5% of global energy investment, which obviously is completely disproportional. The top 10 countries in Africa also account for about 90% of all private sector investment in the energy sector. South Africa alone, I think, accounted for around 40% of that. So if you take South Africa out of the picture and you take the top sort of other countries, 9 other countries out of the picture, then the rest of the continent is receiving virtually no investment into energy. The vast majority of Africa's energy still comes from burning biomass, for heating and for cooking purposes, which is obviously, number one, a very rudimentary way of generating energy, and also is very polluting as well. It's not a sustainable way of doing it. So looking more closely at the energy sector, opportunities abound obviously for renewables. The renewable potential is massive across the continent, and we'll talk about the figures just now. The current opportunity from an investment and an infrastructure perspective largely revolve around solar PV, but there are also some opportunities around hydro and wind at the moment. It's critical to understand that Africa's industrialization will not be driven by renewable energy alone. We do need to drive a combination of investment between renewable energy on the one side, because our renewable energy infrastructure and industries require development, and we need to take advantage of those opportunities. But we also need some kind of baseload power investment as well at the same time. I know that wind is for free, and I know that the sun is for free. And I always get this comment to saying, like, it's for free, you need to use it, but the equipment and the infrastructure required to harvest and to store the energy is not for free. And the cost associated with that means that Africa will not be able to be competitive at an industrial level to be able to produce, manufacture, et cetera, here and export, or even for local consumption. We would not be able to compete for the vast majority of products and services to actually produce and consume or export at local level. So the renewable energy can be very effectively deployed to address Africa's electrification challenge, especially rural electrification, to develop our green manufacturing industries. There are significant opportunities for renewable energy to complement our grids, but the grids do need balancing. The cost associated with storing energy at the moment is not as such, and will not be over the next 10 years to be able to store it at large scale. cost effectively at this stage. Technically, it's doable, but from a cost perspective, it's not viable and will not be over the next 5 years, 5 to 10 years. We do, however, need to take a broader, more holistic approach to carbon emissions, which is really important. So we've got a tendency of focusing very much on one particular industry and only talk about the emissions of that industry and not taking a broader view of our total economies, which is something which we as Africa can actually do, as opposed to some of the developed economies where they are dealing with a lot of legacy infrastructure. And what I mean by that is our transportation infrastructure and sector has not developed yet. It's typically very early stage and very nascent stages of development. And transportation is typically your number 2 on the polluter list of the vast majority of economies around the world. Now, we can set off a very significant proportion of our emissions on the energy generation side by focusing on a combination of renewables and some base loads. So most likely your gas, which is a really good transition, fuel source or feedstock, by offsetting it, by making sure that our transportation and our mobility sectors evolve in such a way that we do not necessarily build up these very pollution heavy mobility and transportation sectors. So we need to view some of the development in Africa also in balance, in order to ensure that we do not just take a look at the energy sector in isolation, but we view our emissions as a country or as a region in a bit more of a holistic way, when we talk about it and when we devolve and then we talk about infrastructure investment in particular and talk about sort of our emissions control. Taking a look at broader opportunities, beyond the generation side, transmission and distribution has got a massive amount of opportunity in the region. Generally, an equal amount of investment is required on transmission and distribution to what you typically invest in generation. So if you invest $100 million in generation, an equal amount of opportunity opens up on transmission and distribution. And for those of you not from the industry, transmission is essentially when you wheel power from the one part of the country to the other part of the country. So your power gets consumed, obviously not where it's generated necessarily, but somewhere else in the country, and that power needs to be wheeled off with high-powered cables from the one side of the country to the other side of the country, and that's the transmission side. And distribution is obviously where you distribute it to the individual homes or businesses or your factories in order for it to be connected and then consumed. Now, the T&D side poses a lot of opportunity because we do not have a lot of private sector participation in transmission and distribution in Africa. On the contrary, the industries and the countries in Africa where we have proper decoupling of generation, transmission, and distribution, and private sector participation, and all of 3 of those are few and far between. Zambia, I think, is one of the few countries that have been able to get that right. So there are a tremendous amount of opportunity in that we still have within our power sector, not just a generation, but also transmission and distribution. Now, if we turn our focus to the wider sustainability opportunities, Africa has a number of value chain segments it could and should target. We've got a tendency again of talking about whole industries that we need to take hold of. So say, for instance, when we talk about the battery industry, we talk about we need to start manufacturing batteries, or we need to start manufacturing electric vehicles, et cetera, which is a very noble objective, but given the practicalities of being able to take control of a whole value chain, given where we're at now, which is typically quite early in the industrialization process, is typically very ambitious and will most likely take quite a long time to get to that point. Now, the electric vehicle industry is about to explode, obviously, at a global level, with a lot of new regulation coming into effect and becoming increasingly stringent as well, sort of leading up to that 2030 level, especially in places like Europe. And many of the metals and minerals required to produce batteries for electric vehicles, for EVs, are found in Africa. If you think manganese, nickel, cobalt, graphite, these are the commodities that are currently shipped off to China in raw format, processed and used in battery manufacturing, and then shipped back to Europe to be used in electric vehicles. Now, if we in Africa just move up 2 steps in the value chain, and this is a presentation in a breakfast session that I attended from one of the development finance institutions recently, and they had the value chain mapped out, and they looked at, how much value that could we increase that we can generate at a local level if we just moved 2 steps up in the value chain, as opposed to exporting, the raw, ore. Just start processing it, and moving from what we're doing at the moment, which is just metal mining, to metal refining and precursor production. We can increase our value contribution 29 times. 29 times just by moving 2 steps forward. So as opposed to being overly ambitious, maybe we should be focusing on very specific segments of the value chain, and making sure that we start adding value in the immediate next step, and the immediate next step, as opposed to being over ambitious and trying to take over the whole of the value chain. Our renewable energy resources can be used to produce green hydrogen, the most promising energy storage technology that we currently have. So Frost Sullivan tracks technologies in the energy sector, and storage technologies in particular, and Africa has the potential to produce 5,000 megatons of hydrogen per year. Now, to put that in context, it's equal to the world's total energy supply today. Now, can you imagine from a monetary perspective what that could be? Even if we produce 15% of that, even if we produce 10 to 15% of that overall energy supply in Africa, and we do that with green hydrogen, what the monetary opportunity would be for Africa to take advantage of that opportunity. I mean, it's absolutely immense. Moving along, the final one, logistics. Logistics is really the lifeblood of our continent, and there are a lot of industries that really rely on our ability to develop the logistics sector in order to be able to evolve as the individual sectors. Food and beverage sector will not develop, for instance, without better infrastructure. A very significant proportion of the arable land in the world still is in sub-Saharan Africa. But the problem that we have in Africa is twofold. Number one is we have a challenge with proving ownership. So the deeds offices in the vast majority of African countries are dysfunctional. So being able to prove ownership of land is very difficult. If you can't prove ownership, you will not capitalize it. If you can't capitalize it, you can't prove ownership, you cannot loan against it. So the vast majority of our agricultural sectors are not commercial, they are subsistence. So that's on the one side, and the other side is because of the weak transportation and logistics infrastructure, both from a physical logistics and normal logistics, and also from a temperature controlled logistics infrastructure perspective. A lot of what we produce rot on the lands, because they cannot physically get it out, or they are dependent on local markets with low pricing, to be able to sell it to. They cannot achieve premium pricing by shipping it off to urban markets, or to tap into international markets, which is a really big problem for Africa's agricultural sector and food sector, for instance. And it speaks to quite a lot about the different sectors as well, across the industry. Backhaul is a really big problem. Our cross-border trade is a really big issue. The African Continental Free Trade Area is a critical initiative to try to advance. One of the biggest challenges that we typically find when we facilitate investment coming into Africa is the scale of the local market opportunity. So whenever there's an investment in a particular area, in a particular country, they take a look at the local and the regional opportunity, to take a look at if there's a significant enough opportunity for them to have some local sales and then export the remainder. And the challenge, obviously, or quite often is, there is some local opportunity, but not large enough, not big enough really to be able to be a significant enough off-taker, which means that we need to tap into regional markets, which immediately puts pressure on the cross-border trade. Now, if you take a look at the figures, Africa's cross-border trade is still interregional trade, 13%. Europe, on contrast, 67%. Asia interregional trade, 58%. We are trailing way behind all of these markets, and it's because our borders are so difficult to cross. Apart from the legislative and the regulatory and the policy components, the physical borders are so difficult to cross because of the physical barriers, because they're so difficult to get through these border posts, etc. So South Africa is by far the most advanced, and because of the advancement of South Africa, you can see it on the graph. That also skews the figures. So if you take South Africa and SADC out of that picture, the rest of the region performs even worse. So these are the things that we need to focus on in order to be able to advance, this region. Now, to summarize, the infrastructure tracker that we've put together proves that there is a healthy project pipeline already in place. The excuse that there is no projects to invest in is not exactly valid. There is an argument to be made that the level that we have will not solve Africa's infrastructure deficit. So we, the 100 billion is big, but we probably need 100 billion a year in order to be able to address the infrastructure deficit. The projects don't necessarily always fit the risk profile of some of the international investors. We are seeing a lot of the local development finance institutions, faring very well in picking the projects that they would like to finance at local level and taking on local risk much more effectively than some of the international development finance institutions. So we need to make our projects more attractive to the international investments. We need to provide better balance between risk and reward. All these things are justified, but there is already a really good platform of projects that we can take advantage of. It is a good starting point. It's not the overall solution. It's not the only solution that we need to put in place, but it is a very big step, we feel in any case, in the right direction to provide good quality information in order for organizations to start moving forward. So if you are interested in learning more, please get in hold of myself or the conference organizers to get a copy of the summary report. And with that, bang on time, we've got a few minutes for questions. So let me stop sharing and Indiwe, back to you. What if I should, Indiwe, are we?
Hi, Hendrik. So I do have some questions for you. And our first question comes from Hanro Steenkamp, and he asks, do you feel that the large Chinese infrastructure investment in Africa is something to be worried about, given that they are known to not employ local workers and lead to piling up of unsustainable debt burdens? Good question.
It's a very good question. And I think that the China factor is obviously something I think that, I think a lot of people talk about, and a lot of people talk about always in a very negative sense. There's a very negative sentiment when we generally hear about China's investment in Africa. And my response is typically, we determine the terms of, when and how China comes into the region. China invests a lot in infrastructure in Africa. They've invested a lot in ports. They've invested a lot in our airports, in other logistics infrastructure, et cetera, But we as Africa determine, number one, where those investments go and the terms associated with those investments. Now, it's our responsibility to make sure that those investments are, number one, sustainable, and number two, that the terms associated with the construction, et cetera, are actually conducive for our local economy. I think it's one of those things where we as Africa need to take responsibility for Africa. We need to take responsibility for our own region. We need to take responsibility for our own economies. We need to take responsibility for our own infrastructure, and blaming China for doing what China is really good at, which is concluding deals in order to be able to get access to resources, access to markets, et cetera, I don't think it's really a valid excuse. China's dynamic has also changed in the fact that China has developed a very significant local market. So, their requirements have also changed quite significantly over the last 5 years, where they've got a very sort of local market they've developed. They've got more than 1 billion people, just like Africa. They're not looking necessarily for an export market for their products. The economy is slightly cooled off, so their demand for commodities on that strong, so China's requirements have also changed quite significantly. So there's an interesting dynamic happening, and we are also sort of watching and to take a look at how China's role in Africa is going to change in the next 2-3 years, especially given the dynamic between China or between Africa and Russia. Russia had a very significant impact from a military perspective on Africa and in Africa. The amount of arms deals, the amount of direct military involvement from Russia's private sort of military forces, the Wagner Group in particular, in quite a number of different economies. If you take a look at how many different countries actually had deals in place with Russia, direct military sales or arms sales and military involvement, it was very significant. Russia will have to take the foot off the gas because they've got bigger problems at home. And the economy that will most likely have the nerve to step in, will be China. Will they take that opportunity or will they not? And the terms will have to be determined by African economies and African leaders. And that balance, I think, is really important. So I don't see China as a bad influence. I see, the decisions that we quite often make at a local level to not be stringent enough with investments coming in. We need to take advantage of our opportunities in a way that's responsible and sustainable, for our people and for our populations and for our infrastructure, over the long term.
Well, that's a beautiful perspective, Hendrik. Thank you for that. We have another question from Reginald Ntloko, and he asks about storage of hydrogen. How easy is it for private companies to get into that arena? What help can be sought to help bring up new players in that segment?
I'm extremely excited about hydrogen. I mean, I was being very serious when I said that hydrogen is the most promising energy storage solution that we currently have, as a sector in the world. I mean, we track these technologies again as Frost and Sullivan. We've taken a look at the cost, we've taken a look at the investment, how the cost is physically coming down over time, and we've mapped where we think, utility level energy storage is going to end up in the next sort of 5 to 10 years. And we think hydrogen is probably going to be it. We think hydrogen is probably, if not the technology, at least one of the technologies, that will likely be at a grid scale, one of the key technologies. Now, at the moment, from a monetary perspective, from a commercial perspective, it's not there yet. But I think a lot of governments around the world, both from a developed country perspective, so governments like Germany in particular, and some of the African governments realize that, look, they need to start lining up deals and collaborations in order to make sure that when the technology does hit, that commercial level, that they're prepared for it, that these deals are in place, that the infrastructure is in place. Companies like Sasol, companies like Mittal, et cetera, are also climbing in, and they're putting in place these in principle deals in order to take a look at how they can take advantage of these opportunities. We have a number of different opportunities that can be taken advantage of in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, and with already existing investments going into the hydrogen corridor, some steel manufacturing down here in the Western Cape. Namibia has put together some deals. I know in North Africa, Morocco, they're putting together some deals. So there are a number of opportunities that are currently being supported by government, but where you can get involved in as part of private sector. And I would suggest that those are the type of opportunities you need to get involved in. From a commercial perspective, just straightforward commercial, it'll be quite difficult, I think, to find opportunities, but everybody is recognizing, the fact that it's around the corner. And given the level of infrastructure required, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years is absolutely nothing. I mean, the magnitude and the scale of these kind of technologies is of such that your planning horizon has got to be 25 years. So a 5 to 10 year ramp up, is not that much if you've got a plan for it. And your feasibility studies take 3 years, 4 years, 5 years to try to get it done and dusted in order to be able to just get the stuff approved, whatnot, start building it and get it constructed and effective, sort of on the ground and operational. So I think, we are very excited about Africa's potential, the renewable energies potential in order to start producing it. Practical example is where we have existing metal production in Africa where you can start switching over to becoming green metal production. And you can immediately start charging significant premiums in the market. Now, if you've got a connected grid, for instance, it becomes an exercise on paper to route specific parts of renewable energy, which hydro, by the way, is classified as renewable energy. And Africa does have a hydro power that's being generated, and still hydro investment that's still happening across the region. Now, if the grid's connected, technically speaking, you can allocate a proportion of that hydro generation to the metal manufacturing, the metal refining. And that metal can be classified green steel, green aluminium, pick a metal and it's green. So you can imagine now what you can do with, again, getting back to the EV industry. Now, all of a sudden, you've got an electric vehicle and an electric vehicle battery, and that's being manufactured with green metals and green mineral production, et cetera, I mean, the opportunities are immense. We like a kid in a candy store when it comes to these things. When we look at them, you kind of like, amazing. I don't know if anybody else is spotting this, but we're going, this is big, and Africa just needs to wake up, because somebody's going to spot this opportunity, and I hope it's not going to be China.
I hope it's not going to be China, and I agree with you. With private sector, and I think this is where Regional is coming from, to say, imagine if private sector took over the Inga Dam and we started producing power from that. I mean, that would be phenomenal. He has a follow-up question to say, what efforts are there internationally to encourage such participation?
I think there are plenty of opportunities, I think, from an international perspective. I mean, I think the key thing that we miss in Africa is a good balance, I think, between the private sector and the public sector. There's a lot of stuff still being driven by public sector in Africa, which I think is a bit of a challenge. I always feel that we need a better balance between the commercial power and the political power within a number of African countries. And I've got to be careful of not stepping on too many toes here this morning, but globally, if you see a lot of the economies working, there's a good balance between those that have political power and those that have economic power. And quite often in Africa, those two get shared, which is not a good thing necessarily. I think it puts too much power in a few individual hands, which means that we don't really have economic empowerment at a broader level. We would want to have, in order to make sure that we can uplift the broader population in Africa, and we can achieve those socioeconomic objectives that we put out for ourselves in Africa 2063, in the sustainable goals, et cetera. So I think in Africa, as these opportunities start developing, and as these mega opportunities also start dawning on, I think, some of the global investors, we will see more private sector investment coming in, and private sector participation in some of these bigger industries, which personally I think is a good thing. I know that there will be challenges associated with it, especially when big private sector comes in and they need to speak to big government, and not always necessarily the best of things, but there will be peripheral opportunities that then sort of start flowing over, and the indirect opportunities and the inferred opportunities. So the indirect economic and socioeconomic development, the inferred development from a job creation and from a socioeconomic development perspective will be immense. Every single time we have infrastructure development in Africa, it's amazing to see physically, if you build a road in Africa, a major road, you look 50 meters to your right, you look 50 meters to your right, and it's entrepreneurship, it's sponsorship, it is activity, it is anything from fruit to vegetables to chickens to this to whatever, little restaurants, and there's activity, there's life, and I look at this and I'm going, surely we must just have more of this. People have a tendency of just taking advantage of opportunity. You go to literally just outside of these massive cities, and as soon as you see any kind of infrastructure going up, people take advantage of it. You need to allow them to do that. You need to enable them, and you need to enable them to then start scaling that to something that's slightly more official. And this is where we start getting into things like get them to use technology more effectively, use the blockchain in order to get them to start tracking their transactions, that they can load against a transaction history as opposed to against an asset base. We are asset light in Africa. We do not have a lot of physical assets necessarily that we can use for collateral in order to be able to get access to debt and scale up businesses. But something like the blockchain has the ability to help us sort of loan against a transaction history. Technology has so many different things that we use and utilize in order to really get this continent moving forward. But we need the infrastructure. We need telecommunications infrastructure and connectivity, rural connectivity to be driven. And I cannot comprehend why we cannot come up with a deal that's conducive for our telecommunications players to say, you want access to 5G, we want rural connectivity. Surely we can come up with something that's conducive for you and for us at the same time.
100%.
I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Hendrik. And then we have a question from Jason, and he says, how do we incorporate BIM, the BIM sector, into the development of Africa? Good question. BIM sector.
What is the BIM sector? I'm tracking a blank here.
So the BIM community is the interconnectedness of it. Jason, do you want to be more specific with regards to where exactly?
Building infrastructure and management. I do apologize.
Actually, Jason, you can raise your hand, Jason, and we can unmute you and you can ask the question directly to building information modeling.
Building information modeling. Okay, look, this is involved in everything. I think there's obviously a lot of small construction happening in Africa, and you saw that in that initial graph that general construction makes up a very significant proportion. I think the formal construction industry is definitely lagging, and it's because of a lack of regulation of significant part of the industry. Now, I think we've got to be careful of over-regulating a significant proportion of Africa. We've got to be careful of applying Europe and America to the African environment. And I think we're quite often guilty of that, of trying to over-regulate an unregulated environment and then not really understanding what the local operating conditions are. There's a proportion of the industry that needs to be regulated. When you are dealing with schools and you are dealing with healthcare and you are dealing with food, et cetera, there are certain elements that need to be adhered to, et cetera. And there are certain times that you should not necessarily, over-regulate it when it comes to rural housing, et cetera. So there's a balance, I think, that need to be struck between the two. And hence, I think, our dysfunctional, non-functional deeds officers, one of the things I think that we really do need to fix, and it's one of the things I never hear for some reason people talk about. It's one of the fundamental building blocks of trying to get access to credit. Is you've got to be able to prove ownership of the piece of land that you want to build on.
Yeah.
So a very significant proportion, and I'm talking about the majority of African countries, do not actually have the ability to prove ownership of a piece of land. You will have the deed to a piece of land, and somebody else will rock up 2 weeks later after you built your building and go like, oh, hold on, I've got something that's more recent, or I've got something that's older, or I can supersede yours, and it depends on who the deeds office like, better you or the other guy. So there are some basic elements I think that we need to address in order to be able to promote some of the more formal elements of the building industry to be able to advance. But only parts of the industry. We've got to be careful of over-regulating, Africa in a European sense or an American sense. There are, we've got to apply local to local. I always feel that, we just need to be careful of chucking out the baby with the bathwater sometimes. We've got to try and be so, especially in places like South Africa, we've got a tendency of trying to be so first world, so aligned with all the international countries. And I'm going like, guys, we're not there. It's great and it's ambitious and it's wonderful, but we've got other problems that are more pressing that we need to be focusing on, fundamental things, and I think they'll require our attention.
100%, Hendrik. And on that deeds office issue, I know Ghana are one of the African countries who've actually taken the paperwork onto online. So they've gone digital with regards to deeds. And what they did, one of the architects who sits in my advisory board for the African Smart Cities Summit was responsible for physically being in the country, measuring the land, and then assigning those pieces, if it belongs to government, if someone has a title deed to it. Long process, but they did it. I know Kenya now are currently doing that. They're doing a whole land investigation and then taking all of that data onto online. And for part of smart cities, we're trying to figure out if South Africa will follow suit. Everything lives on paper. And if those deeds officers, especially the one down in Cape Town, were to go down in fire, if you have a title deed and you don't have a copy of it, it's as if you don't even have a piece of land. So you're right. We need to start talking about the actual land space, because that will actually determine the kind of ownership. Is it government or is it private sector owned? Regional comebacks, and he's asking a question. You mentioned that if Africa can be involved in manufacturing of manganese, nickel, cobalt, and such, the production of EV batteries can be increased 29 times. So how are our local governments supported or encouraged to initiate the mining of these elements, even to bring in private entities into that space? Good question.
Yeah, so just to qualify the statement, so we currently mine manganese, nickel, cobalt, et cetera, across sub-Saharan Africa. So it's from places like Zambia, from Tanzania, from DRC, from South Africa. So there are quite a number of different countries across the region that currently do mine it, but they export the vast majority of it in raw format. It doesn't get processed here. It doesn't get refined here. We don't do any value addition here. We export it in raw format. So, you can go to the port of Port Elizabeth and you can see the sort of the black rocks of manganese literally being loaded onto the ships in raw format, and they get shipped to China and they get refined on that side. They get processed, they get put into the EVs, onto the batteries and the EVs, and then they literally get shipped around the south point of South Africa back into Europe. You kind of go like, this supply chain does not make sense. I don't know about sort of supported and encouraged. I don't think they should be supported and encouraged in any shape or form to do anything. They must just do it. The incentive is the value addition that we can generate. There's a tremendous amount of economic upside. There's a social upside. The amount of foreign exchange that we can generate, gross domestic product that we can generate, the job creation, direct, indirect, and inferred job creation that we can generate, the foreign direct investment from an infrastructure perspective we can generate, the long-term contracts that we can put in place, not even to talk about the spillover effects around increased credit ratings that will reduce the interest rates for us longer term, that will in turn sort of reduce the overall sort of debt burden for South Africa. I can go on about this stuff, but it's immense if you start taking a look at, if we start taking advantage of the natural opportunity that's right in front of us, that we don't have to go look for. It's not stuff that's pie in the sky. We know that the automotive industry is at a dire straits level, stage. They had a fork in the road. They cannot continue doing the combustion engines. The mobility industry is the number 2 polluter in the world. You've got energy number 1, you've got mobility number 2. After energy has gone through the entire thing, who do you think is going to be number 2? They're already turning screws. They're already saying they're banning all the combustion engines from city centers, all the major countries in Europe. They're going to start doing that in other places around the world as well. EVs is going to be the future, and after EVs you're going to have other sources of fuel. So batteries is the thing. What's going to be after that? And it's not just going to be cars. There are going to be a bunch of other stuff running off battery technology stuff as well. So what are the longer term trends, and how do we position ourselves to do that? And again, it's not rocket science. It's not stuff that we need to invent. The trends are there. The writing is on the wall. Everybody has been talking about these things for a long time. We know that the plans have been made. We just need to respond to those. So the incentive and the encouragement is really the advantages associated for all our economies. And last point, if we can now start working together as the region to say, like, hold on, okay, so DRC, we got Tanzania, we got Zambia, we got Botswana, we got South Africa. How about we start integrating and interacting, and start cross-border trade, and start putting up the lines of logistics and making sure that our cross-border trade can function more properly. We create, safe zones for, for cross-border trade for specific type of products. If you put a sticker on, if you got a tag on, it's sealed or whatever, and you have one road straight, you've got a separate road, one road straight that runs from Tanzania to whatever port, whether it be, Durban or, somewhere else around the you need to run to in order to be able to offload the goods. If there's congestion at the one port, you can run to the other port. There are practical solutions to the problems that we face. You just need to have your right cap on.
Your thinking cap on. So true. And then Tony asks, there's still very much a lack of SME development and support. How can this be boosted, as it probably forms the most important part of overall upliftment?
I think one of the things about SME development, I think that we tend to get wrong is the fact that we think that SME development is the point in itself. We try to have a direct focus on SME development, as opposed to having a balanced focus between corporate development on the one side and the spin-off development that will happen for SMEs from that. We've got this idea that if you take a look at a lot of the economic development agencies in South Africa, for instance, there's a very strong focus on SME development. You don't necessarily focus on corporate development. They don't focus on necessarily getting the Googles in South Africa and getting the GEs back in South Africa and getting the large corporations back in South Africa. Now, if you have these large institutions getting back in South Africa, your SME sectors will start latching onto those large. And that's a fact. You take a look at the economic development spin-offs from larger corporate industrial investments, and SMEs always win. They always win. If you put the right supporting mechanism then in place for that, now you've got a thriving industry. The second point is we are fixated on university level qualification in this country, as opposed to focusing on vocational training, practical training for entrepreneurs. The solution, I feel, for Africa's employment problem is not university level qualifications. It's got to play. We need innovation. We need all the technical skills. We need the PhDs, et cetera, but that's a small proportion of our population that require that. The vast majority of our population require practical training, how to make ends meet. How do I buy something, sell something at a profit? How do I make out of nothing? How do I identify opportunities? How do I run my finances constructively? How do I make sure that I put something together as a business, run a small business effectively? Where do I get finance for something like that? Where do I get support for something like that? Where do I get basic financial training, or basic IT training in order to be able to manage and be able to drive a laptop or a computer, or basic digital skills, etc. We're talking about vocational-based digital training and entrepreneurship training, etc., that we need to start focusing on. We shove our poor kids into colleges, into universities, and what do they come up with? They come up with debt, and they come up with dreams which they cannot fulfill. And what do we end up with? We end up with riots. And that if they were, you've got to feel for these kids. They end up with it that they cannot service after how many years of studying, and they go like, what do I do now? I know, and I cannot get a job, but I've got debts to service, and the bank is behind me in order to get their 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 rand a month. Vocational training around entrepreneurship, I feel is just, we underplay it and we don't give it enough attention. And that vocational training aspect at school level even, and then it's at tertiary level, I think it's so important for our country, for our region, for our continent, and bringing in the digital component in that in order to educate people. How do you enable yourself to help yourself from a digital perspective? Because once you've got the basic skills, you can help yourself. We all know that, right? I'm not the biggest digital whiz, but I mean, I can help myself, because you probably program pops up and you're like, you can go to the file and this or whatever, and struggling for something for 45 minutes, and off you go, and you can wing it, right? Because you've done it a number of times. Somebody helped you to get the basic and the foundational elements in place. And then invest in new things like natural language processing and all these other things. Can't interact with computer necessarily at a digital level, but they can use natural language then to interact with a digital device. And those are the things which the PhDs now need to come in saying like, right, so how about we focus on technologies that can help Africa, meet Africa where it's at, that population that we cannot help, that we cannot reskill, that we cannot enable to get into the fourth industrial revolution. How do we get that part in? How do we use augmented reality? How do we use NLP in order to get that part of the population sort of back to the 21st century? And that should get those are the things that I'm just going like, yes, let's invest in that as opposed to another theoretical PhD. And I'm pretty sure I'm going to get a couple of after this webinar, but anyway.
I love it. And then we've got Nebo, and he asks, as access to affordable capital is also a huge hindrance in capital projects' return of investment. How can Africa reduce the ever-escalating construction cost and reduce cost to finance to spur further development of infrastructure to allow the private sector to enter the space?
I think I'm not an expert in this space, and I don't have any sort of silver bullet answers on this one. I do feel that government involvement quite often needs to be not necessarily as a direct investor, but as a risk reducer in a lot of the larger scale infrastructure projects, where government becomes the catch net as opposed to being directly involved in some of these engagements. A lot of the infrastructure development in Africa requires a reduction in risk. So going back to the presentation, quite often our balance between risk and reward is slightly out of sync for a lot of our projects. So yes, there are a lot of projects in that pipeline of projects that we presented, 300 plus projects, $100 US. That's really good. So it's a lot bigger than the vast majority of the DFIs that I spoke to at COP and at these wonderful sort of gatherings, etc. But a lot of these projects that will look at them, they go like, don't like the risk profile of this one. Government's role, in my view, should quite often be to reduce the risk of those projects in order to make sure that the risk-reward ratio becomes better. Not directly involved necessarily. They don't want investment. They just need to be involved from a catch-net perspective, so that if the project for some reason goes south, government will step in and support the project either from an insurance perspective or whatever perspective. That means also that you can support a lot more projects. So as opposed to direct involved, and you get 100 million, you can now support 10 projects because only 1 out of the 10 will most likely go south. So you can use 100 million, support 10 projects, private sector can do all 10 projects, and you can take the one project that goes south and you can give the 100 million to that project and you can pay out the stakeholders, et cetera, et cetera. So in order, how to reduce the financing costs, more projects, more involvement, more competition in Africa. More competition, more private sector involvement, the DFIs need to be more involved. There are a lot of development finance institutions that are very much looking at opportunities in Africa. We need to put the opportunities on the table, which is part of this infrastructure tracker. We did this initially as part of an initiative for some of the structured finance and some of the project finance clients, and we realized that from economic development and socioeconomic development perspective, this thing's got legs. We need to make some of the information available. Because a lot of people are just going like, there aren't any projects. Where are the projects? And we're like, we've got it on the database. They're going like, yeah, okay, fine. And then they move on. So we need to make a lot of this information available for free on platforms like these, in order to say to people, here are the figures, here are the trends, here are the opportunities. Take a look at this. So we need more players, more competition, more projects. So it's a question of being more vocal about these things, and to you guys for making these kind of things available. And I think during COVID, it was one of my biggest concerns, the fact that conferences like these will not have the platform to communicate messages like these. You guys play a really important role, not just in helping individuals connect with each other, but getting some of these messages out and communicating the level of opportunity that is in the region. So be virtual, will be physical, I don't care. Somebody needs to provide that platform for people to be able to get that message across. It's very difficult to do that one-on-one. It's
Yeah.
you've got to do that at a collective level. So anyways, it's good to be back on the circuit.
Happy to have you back on. Hendrik, thank you so much for your time. My closing shot to you, you said that 2023 will be a dynamic and positive year for Africa. And I'm going to launch you with that to say, what are your closing words based on that line you said?
I think we said a lot, I think, during this session. I think just in general, we are extremely positive, I think, about the region. Given the fact that entrepreneurship is through the roof. I mean, VC investment, angel investment, we're seeing an increase in infrastructure investment. We've seen a significant increase in the quality of policy being rolled out in quite a number of different countries. With the risk of sounding slightly melodramatic, this could be the start of the African Renaissance that we've all been waiting for. There are a number of different pieces of the puzzle that have been missing up until this point that have now been put in place. So we are watching this very, very closely and going like, this could be a very, very exciting phase for Africa's development. There are a number of international economic and political stars lining up for the region. It's our job to take advantage of those. And if we do, I think this is the start of a really exciting phase and stage for Africa's development. So
I love it. I love it. Thank you so much. This is not our last webinar. It's the first of many in the build-up to the Big Five Construct Southern Africa. What we do want to do is include more of these conversations. Like you said, it's these platforms that actually bring the information to people. Everyone complains about access, and I couldn't agree with you more to say this is why we are in this business, to bring information to people. Hendrik, always a pleasure. So grateful for your time this morning. Thank you so much.
Been a pleasure.
All right. And to our guests still online, thank you so much for joining us this morning. We are ending off now this webinar, and I'm just going to move on with my screen here with regards to the other information we have. This recording, as well as the report that was done by Frost and Sullivan, will be emailed through to you after this webinar. We want you to have a look at the document. We want you to replay this webinar again and get in the figures, the opportunities that exist on the African continent. The Big Five Construct Southern Africa prides itself of giving information to the industry. We believe that we are the connectors of all the stakeholders, from supplier through to public sector. We involve everyone into how do we build a better Africa for ourselves. Join us next year from the 27th through 29th of June 2023 at the Gallagher Convention Center, where we will be hosting 3 days of impactful information, workshops. We have exhibitions running for the whole 3 days. Come through and network, come through and get your business done. There are opportunities in Africa. We've just proven that this morning. They exist in billions of US dollars. Take advantage of that through these platforms that we create. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Have a lovely, lovely festive season. And again, as Hendrik said, 2023 will be a dynamic and positive year for Africa. It's up to you to make it yours. Thanks a lot. Bye.